In an instant, my world shattered as my husband's voice, sharp and full of anger, sliced through the phone. "Why do you always collapse when I need you?" he snapped, as if unaware of the emergency that had me rushing to the hospital, my unborn child's life hanging in the balance. "We're here, hungry, waiting for your terrible cooking, and you're off relaxing in the hospital," he continued, his words lacking any trace of concern. He coldly declared that he'd had enough and was going out to eat with his parents, leaving me to figure out how to get home on my own. Even through the phone, his anger reached me, making me feel as though I were somehow to blame for the dire situation. Fear and worry gripped me, especially for our unborn child, whom I was desperately trying to protect. I used to be a passionate, successful cosmetic salesperson, earning accolades for my dedication, with a reputation built on hard work and excellence. I loved my job, the confidence it gave me, and the sense of fulfillment it provided. Then I met my husband, and what seemed like a fairy tale romance quickly led to marriage. But the news of my pregnancy forced a difficult choice. I left my job to safeguard the health of our baby, understanding the risks of miscarriage, all for the sake of our family. As the pregnancy progressed, the support I once had from my husband began to evaporate. His excitement turned to frustration, and simple tasks became monumental challenges. My attempts to meet his expectations often felt like failures. "Where's my lunch?" he'd ask, then scoff at the sandwiches I managed to prepare, dismissing them as inadequate, mocking my inability to handle smells. "Pregnancy is not an illness," he would say, belittling my struggles, as if I were faking it all. His words stung, and the man I once adored seemed to disappear. Gone were the days of attending doctors' visits together, and I was left to shoulder the household burdens alone. Our home, once filled with love and mutual respect, had turned into a battlefield, with me fighting to protect both myself and our child, clinging to the hope that somehow we could rediscover the understanding we had lost. Maybe it was stress. He'd taken on a mentorship role at work, and the demands were clearly wearing him down. Perhaps this was why he'd grown so short-tempered and irritable with me. I told myself that once the baby arrived and his schedule settled, things would improve, we'd find our rhythm, and everything would be okay. I whispered to my belly, trying to reassure myself, "It's going to be okay," despite the turmoil in my body and in our relationship. But things didn't improve. The tension between us continued to rise, compounded by the frequent, unannounced visits from my in-laws. They would arrive at the house uninvited, scrutinizing everything, the cleanliness of our home, the state of our preparations for the baby. Yet, they expected me to entertain them, demanding meals on the spot. Caught off guard and unprepared, I could do nothing but try my best, only to be criticized for not being a better host. Each visit ended in disappointment, with my husband always siding with them, never defending me. No matter how hard I tried, it was never enough. One afternoon, while heavily pregnant, I was sent out to buy groceries, and the strain proved too much. I collapsed. I woke up in the hospital, groggy and weak, only to learn that I had passed out from overexertion. Thankfully, the baby was fine, but the doctors insisted on keeping me for a few days of observation. When I saw missed calls from my husband, I felt a pang of guilt. He must have been worried when I hadn't returned from the store, but when I finally called him back, I wasn't met with concern or relief. Instead, his voice was filled with anger. "Where have you been?" he demanded, as if my health and our baby's safety were an inconvenience to him. I felt a chill run through me. "I'm sorry, I collapsed at the store and had to be rushed to the hospital. They've got me on 4 fluids and said I need to stay for observation," I explained, but his response was cold and impatient, as if my condition were nothing more than an interruption. "You collapsed and I'm supposed to care? Why didn't you answer when I called?" "You're so slow." His words stung, each one sinking deeper into my heart, leaving me too shaken to think clearly. "Please stop yelling. It's not good for the baby," I pleaded, but my words seemed to fall on deaf ears. He kept going, his anger unabated. "We're here, starving, waiting on your terrible cooking, and you're just relaxing in the hospital," he said, as though it were my fault that I was here and not at home, preparing a meal. He told me he was going out with his parents and left me to figure out how to get home. His words, harsh and devoid of any care, made me recoil. I didn't want to expose my baby to any more negativity, so I ended the call, retreating back into the sterile confines of the hospital room, tears beginning to fall uncontrollably. And then, through my overwhelming sadness, a comforting voice called to me. "Are you okay?" I looked up, surprised to see Helen, a familiar customer, standing by my bedside. I had grown close to Helen during my time as a cosmetic salesperson, and when I saw her standing there, offering me a towel, relief and warmth flooded through me. Helen, it's really you. I'm so glad you remember me. Our reunion felt like a twist of fate, a much-needed reminder that kindness and human connection could still exist in my darkest hour. Helen had been more than just a customer. After a difficult divorce, she had lost her confidence and stopped wearing makeup altogether. I recalled the day I first approached her at the cosmetics counter, offering to help her try some new products. The change in her was more than physical, it was an emotional breakthrough, a step toward reclaiming her self-esteem. Over time, Helen became more than a customer, she became a friend. But then, about 5 years before I left my job, she suddenly stopped coming, and I had always wondered what happened to her. Now, here she was, a beacon of support when I needed it the most. I came back hoping to reconnect with you, Helen, I said. I tried to visit your old workplace, but I was so surprised to learn you had left. Helen shared her story, her voice a mix of surprise and regret. I'm sorry for disappearing like that, she began. I had to go abroad for work, and it's been so hectic. I run a business over there, and it's been ages since I've had time for myself. Once things finally settled down, I decided to return, and wouldn't you know it, right after I tried to find you, I ended up here with appendicitis, she explained, laughing lightly. It's in the early stages, so medication should take care of it, and if I were still overseas, the treatment would have cost me a fortune. So, in a way, I'm actually relieved it happened here. Her lightheartedness was contagious, and the unexpected reunion lifted my spirits. We spent the next while reminiscing about old times, the weight of my troubles momentarily forgotten in her company. At one point, Helen, her smile as kind as ever, asked gently, "You don't have to share if you don't want to, but I couldn't help but notice you seemed upset earlier. What's going on?" I trusted Helen, more than just as a former customer but as a true friend, so I opened up about my struggles with my husband and my in-laws. I'm really worried about bringing my child into such an environment, afraid that they'll be treated the same way I am. And now, without my job, the idea of living independently, especially with a child, feels impossible. To my surprise, Helen made an incredibly generous offer. I actually have an apartment available, she said, her voice full of sincerity. I manage a few properties as part of a project I started on land I inherited. It's a cozy 2-bedroom with soundproof walls, a separate bathroom, and it's in a safe neighborhood with everything you might need nearby. No deposit required, and you can start paying rent whenever you're settled. It's a really good deal. I was taken aback by her kindness. Are you sure you can offer it to me under such good terms? I asked, overwhelmed by the generosity she was showing. Absolutely, Helen replied. I trust you. You've always been kind and responsible, and I think it's important to help each other out when we can. You're welcome to stay there. No pressure, no strings attached. Her offer, so selfless and full of love, brought tears to my eyes. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Thank you, I whispered, the weight of the world lifting off my shoulders. A few days later, after the doctors cleared me to leave, I packed up and moved directly into the apartment Helen had offered. She had arranged everything over the phone, setting up utilities and ensuring the place was ready for me without me having to ask. I didn't return to the home I shared with my husband. Instead, I embraced this new chapter in Helen's welcoming apartment. I felt guilty for not paying rent immediately, but Helen laughed it off, assuring me it was all taken care of. While my husband was at work, I quietly returned to our old home to collect my belongings. It struck me just how little of that house still felt like mine. The walls that had once held memories now felt empty, just like my heart. Helen's kindness didn't stop with the apartment. She introduced me to a lawyer who had once helped her, guiding me through the steps I needed to take for a divorce. The lawyer's encouragement gave me hope, and with each hospital visit that confirmed my baby's health, my resolve grew stronger. On one visit, as I stepped outside, my heart sank. There, waiting for me, was my husband. Panic surged through me, and I tried to retreat, but my pregnant body moved too slowly. He grabbed my arm, pulling me toward him, demanding to know why I had seen a lawyer and where I was living. I'm going to communicate through the lawyer, I said firmly, standing my ground. Any discussions about the divorce or child support should go through them. I refused to let him bully me any longer. As he tried to drag me back to the car, a young woman intervened, stepping in front of me protectively. What's going on here? She asked, her voice firm. It was Rebecca, a new employee at my husband's workplace, who had previously reported his inappropriate behavior and had been assigned to a different mentor. The tension between them was palpable, but Rebecca didn't back down. She stood her ground, blocking my husband from taking me against my will. "You need to let her go," she said, her voice unwavering. "If you don't, I'll call the police." The mention of the police caused my husband's demeanor to change. Fear flashed across his face, and he quickly released his grip on me. Without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there in disbelief. Rebecca, ever the protector, immediately reached out to make sure I was okay. "Are you all right?" she asked, her concern genuine. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "I'm fine," I replied, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. Without hesitation, Rebecca called a taxi for me, insisting on making sure I got home safely. I felt guilty for causing any trouble, but she reassured me it was no trouble at all. When I told her where I lived, she was surprised to learn that we were neighbors. Rebecca, I soon learned, had also worked with George, my husband, and had been part of a group of employees who had reported his inappropriate behavior. She shared that he was known for making insensitive comments about personal matters, from menstruation to marriage. As we chatted, I realized that Rebecca's courage, combined with Helen's unwavering support, had given me the strength to stand up for myself and my child. I knew it all too well, the manipulation and mistreatment that George had subjected me to, especially during my pregnancy. 3 weeks after our meeting, Rebecca and I had formed a strong bond, sharing dinners and becoming close friends. She kept me updated on George's downfall at work. He had been transferred to a subsidiary company following a string of complaints about his behavior. What I didn't know was that Rebecca was actually Helen's daughter. Helen, a successful businesswoman who managed multiple properties, had been involved in George's professional downfall. George had bragged about handling Helen's accounts, but his behavior toward her, and later toward me, had prompted Helen to take action. Once she learned about his actions, Helen pushed for George's transfer, a move that shifted the balance in his life. Rebecca had already taken a stand against George at work, addressing his misconduct without relying on her mother's influence. But once she realized the connection between me and her mother, she was even more determined to take action. Helen had encouraged Rebecca to present the evidence against George, which ultimately led to his transfer. With George's transfer came a significant decrease in his income and a heavier workload. His position had changed drastically, and I could see the frustration in his attempts to reach out to me. Helen, with her wealth of experience, advised me to remain firm in my decision to divorce and not to be swayed by his attempts to gain sympathy. Her guidance gave me the strength I needed to stay resolute. After I filed for divorce, George tried to contact me through the lawyer, lamenting how difficult work had become and how much he missed me. He even apologized, begging me to come back, but I remained firm in my decision, bolstered by Helen's wisdom. Eventually, George had no choice but to agree to the divorce terms and provide child support and damages. But the next challenge came from my in-laws, particularly my father-in-law. I had expected them to react, but nothing could have prepared me for the day my father-in-law grabbed my arm as I was heading out. He had been following Rebecca, apparently hoping to confront her, but when he saw me, his eyes lit up with a sense of entitlement. He demanded that I hand over my child when he was born, claiming that the baby was the family heir. Despite my attempts to free myself, his grip was strong, and I felt panic rising. Just then, a firm voice demanded he let me go, followed by a swift judo move that sent my father-in-law stumbling. It was Rebecca, stepping in to protect me. She had mastered judo for self-defense during tough times, and it was clear she wasn't afraid to use her skills. Rebecca, a top-ranked judoka with national titles, confronted my father-in-law, criticizing him for his disregard of George's actions and his attempt to interfere in my life. She made it clear that I had every right to start anew and that meddling was the last thing they should be doing. Rebecca's calmness and strength were a sharp contrast to the tension of the moment. The sound of sirens grew louder, and it turned out Rebecca had called the police before coming to my rescue. My mother-in-law, who had been waiting in the car, watched silently as the police arrived and took both my father-in-law and mother-in-law away. My father-in-law was arrested, and after some reflection, my mother-in-law decided to divorce him. She moved back to the countryside, wanting a life free from the chaos that had dominated her marriage. George, trying to salvage something from the situation, begged his mother to take him with her, citing his dissatisfaction with his job and the constant legal battles, but she firmly rejected him. and in an act of reconciliation, she apologized through the lawyer. She also left some money as a gesture of goodwill, likely her way of apologizing for her past behavior and supporting my son's future. I was surprised by her change of heart, but I appreciated her attempt to make amends. After finalizing the divorce, I gave birth to a healthy baby boy. My mother-in-law settled into her new life in the countryside, and George's reputation continued to deteriorate. When my father-in-law was eventually released from custody, he discovered that the house he had once shared with my mother-in-law had been demolished. My mother-in-law had taken drastic steps to start anew. He ended up moving in with George, which led to more trouble and, eventually, George resigning from his job due to the damage to his reputation. Despite all the turmoil, the child support payments continued to arrive reliably, managed through the lawyer and likely with Helen's oversight. Rebecca, meanwhile, received recognition at work and was promoted to project leader, admired by her colleagues for her competence and resolve. Helen's various projects, including housing for women and properties for foreigners, continued to thrive. As for me, once my son was old enough, I decided to return to work. Helen offered me a position at a new high-end cosmetics store she was opening. Her support never wavered, and she continued to treat my son as if he were her own grandchild. Rebecca, too, made time to visit us, and both of them reminded me daily of the strength and kindness that had helped me through the hardest of times. I was determined to be just as strong and protective of my son, inspired by the incredible women who had stood by me when I needed it most.